Tonight, we step away from the noise of the world and into the quietness of the Buddha's wisdom. These aren't teachings that demand anything from you. They're offerings, gentle reminders of the peace that exists beneath the surface of your busy mind. Welcome to Buddha Bedtime Stories. This is your sacred pause, where ancient truth meets your need for rest. I'm curious to know, what time is it where you are? And where are you listening from tonight? Please share in the comments. The Buddha walked this earth over 2,000 years ago, yet his insights into the human heart remain as fresh as this moment. He understood suffering intimately, and he discovered the way through it. Tonight, his wisdom becomes yours. These stories will work on you gently, the way moonlight works on a dark room. You don't need to chase understanding. Just allow the teachings to arrive in their own time, in their own way. Before we begin, take a moment to truly care for your comfort. Let your body find its most natural, restful position. There should be no strain anywhere, nothing pulling or holding tight. Breathe in slowly, feeling the breath move all the way down into your belly. And release, letting your shoulders drop, your jaw soften. One more deep breath, inviting your entire being to rest. Let us enter the first story together. There was a ship's navigator named Takeshi, who prided himself on never losing his way. He had sailed the coastal waters for 20 years, and in all that time, he had never once deviated from his intended course. He relied on a compass that had been given to him by his father, a master navigator, and this compass had never failed him. Takeshi's confidence in his navigational abilities was absolute. He knew exactly where he was at all times, could calculate his position by the stars, by the currents, by the wind. His captain trusted him completely, and other sailors spoke of Takeshi as someone who could navigate through the darkest night or the heaviest fog without ever being uncertain of his position. But one day, during what should have been a routine voyage along a familiar coast, something happened that shattered Takeshi's certainty. His compass began behaving strangely. The needle wavered, spun unpredictably, and then stopped working entirely. When Takeshi tried to get his bearings from the stars, heavy clouds covered the sky. The familiar landmarks he usually used were hidden by an unusual mist. For the first time in 20 years, Takeshi was lost. His initial reaction was panic. Without his compass, without his usual reference points, he felt completely disoriented. The ship was still moving, but he had no confidence in the direction they were heading. Every decision felt uncertain. Should they continue forward or turn back? Should they anchor and wait for the fog to clear, or try to push through? The captain came to find him. "Takeshi, what's our position?" "I don't know," Takeshi admitted, the words painful to say. "My compass is broken. I can't see the stars. The landmarks are hidden. Captain, I'm lost." The captain was quiet for a moment, then said something unexpected. "Good. Maybe now you'll actually see where we are." Takeshi was confused. "But I don't know where we are." "That's the problem. You've sailed these waters for 20 years, the captain said. You've relied on your instruments and your calculations. But have you ever really looked at the water itself? Have you ever paid attention to how it feels to sail through it, rather than just measuring your position within it?" The captain walked to the rail and looked out at the misty water. When I started sailing, I had no instruments. I learned to read the water, the wind, the subtle signs that told me where I was and where I was going. You've always had your compass, so you never develop that sense. Maybe being lost is your opportunity to find a different way of knowing. Takeshi wanted to argue, but the truth was they had no choice. The compass was broken, and no amount of worry would fix it. He would have to navigate without his primary tool, without the certainty he had always relied on. So he began to pay attention in ways he never had before. He noticed the color of the water, which changed subtly with depth and seafloor composition. He felt the temperature of the wind on his face, which varied based on what land masses it had passed over. He watched the patterns of seabirds, which could indicate proximity to shore. He listened to the sound of the waves against the hull, which changed depending on bottom depth and current patterns. All of these signs had always been there. He just had never needed to notice them because his compass had told him everything he thought he needed to know. Now, forced to rely on more subtle indicators, he discovered a whole language of navigation he had been blind to. After several hours of this intense attention, Takeshi realized something. He had a sense of where they were, not the precise, measured certainty his compass had provided, but a felt sense, an intuitive knowing based on multiple subtle cues. It wasn't as comfortable as the false certainty his compass had given him, but it felt more real, more connected to the actual experience of being on the water. He gave the captain his best estimate of their position and the direction they should sail. "Are you sure?" the captain asked. "No," Takeshi admitted, "but I'm not completely lost either. I'm somewhere in between, navigating by feel rather than by certainty." They sailed based on Takeshi's intuitive navigation. Several hours later, when the fog finally cleared, they discovered they were exactly where Takeshi had estimated, perhaps even more accurately positioned than if he had been rigidly following his compass bearing. A Zen monk was traveling on the ship, making a pilgrimage to a distant temple. He had watched Takeshi's struggle with interest. That evening, he approached the navigator. "You've learned something valuable today," the monk said. "I've learned that I've been overly dependent on my tools," Takeshi replied. "That's a humbling lesson." "More than that," the monk said, "you've learned that there are different kinds of knowing. The compass gave you one kind, precise, measurable, certain, but it was a narrow knowing. It told you your position, but nothing about the water you were moving through, the wind you were sailing on, the life of the ocean around you." He looked out at the darkening water. When you lost that narrow certainty, you found a broader knowing. Less precise perhaps, but more connected, more alive, more responsive to what's actually happening rather than what should be happening according to your instruments. Takeshi thought about this. But isn't certainty important? Don't we need to know where we are? "There are different kinds of certainty," the monk replied. "The compass gave you the certainty of measurement. But measurement isn't the same as understanding. Today, without your compass, you develop the certainty of relationship. You know where you are not because an instrument tells you, but because you're in relationship with the water, the wind, the birds, all the subtle signs. This kind of knowing is less precise but more intimate." Over the following days, even after Takeshi had replaced his broken compass with a new one, he found himself relying on it less. He had discovered that he could navigate by reading the signs around him, by paying attention to subtle cues, by trusting his felt sense of position and direction. The compass was useful for confirmation, but he no longer needed it as his primary tool. Other navigators noticed the change in Takeshi's approach. He seemed more relaxed, more connected to the sailing itself rather than anxiously checking his instruments every few minutes. Younger navigators would ask him for advice. The most important thing, Takeshi would tell them, is to not become so dependent on your tools that you lose your own capacity to sense and understand. Tools are useful, compasses are valuable, but if you rely on them exclusively, you become helpless when they fail. And more than that, you miss the actual experience of navigating, of being in relationship with the water you're moving through. He would tell them about the day his compass broke. I thought I was lost, and in one way I was. I had lost my usual certainty, my measured precision. But in another way, I found something I had been missing for 20 years. I found direct contact with the elements I was navigating through. I found a different kind of knowing that doesn't come from instruments but from attention and relationship. One young navigator asked, "But what if you're wrong? What if you follow your intuition and it leads you astray?" "That can happen," Takeshi admitted. "Just as following a compass can lead you astray if the compass is broken or if there's magnetic interference you don't know about. No method is perfect. But when you're navigating by attention and relationship, you notice when things don't feel right. You can adjust. When you're blindly following an instrument, you might sail confidently in the wrong direction without realizing it until it's too late." Years passed, and Takeshi's reputation changed. Instead of being known as the navigator who never lost his way, he became known as the navigator who could find his way even when lost. People understood there was a difference, and the second reputation was actually more valuable. A merchant who hired Takeshi for a difficult voyage once asked him, "What happens if we get lost?" Takeshi smiled. "We probably will get lost at some point. Weather changes, conditions shift, instruments fail. But being lost isn't the problem. Staying lost is the problem. And I've learned how to find my way even when the usual markers are gone. Being lost has become part of how I navigate, not something I try to prevent at all costs." The voyage was indeed difficult, with unexpected storms and compass problems. But Takeshi navigated through all of it, sometimes with certainty, sometimes with intuition, sometimes acknowledging that he wasn't sure but making his best estimate based on all available information. The ship arrived safely and the merchant was impressed. "You seem comfortable with uncertainty," the merchant observed. "I've learned to be," Takeshi replied. "Certainty is valuable when you can have it, but most of life involves some degree of uncertainty, some degree of not knowing exactly where you are or where you're going. The question is whether that uncertainty paralyzes you or whether you can navigate through it, using whatever signs are available, trusting your judgment, adjusting as you go." He looked out at the harbor where they had docked. "That day my compass broke was one of the most important days of my sailing life. It forced me to develop capacities I had been neglecting. It taught me that there are many ways of knowing, and the most precise isn't always the most useful. It showed me that being lost can be the beginning of finding a better way." The merchant nodded thoughtfully. I think I've been sailing through my business life the same way you used to sail, following my instruments, my plans, my certainties. And when things don't go according to plan, when my compass breaks, I panic. Maybe I need to learn what you learned. Maybe you do, Takeshi agreed. Maybe we all do. Because life is going to break our compasses. It's going to take away our certainties and our familiar reference points. The question is whether we fall apart when that happens, or whether we discover we have other capacities, other ways of knowing, other methods of finding our way. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what compasses have broken in your life. What certainties have you lost? What familiar reference points are no longer available? These losses can feel frightening, disorienting, like being lost at sea without navigation tools. But what if being lost isn't the disaster you think it is? What if it's an opportunity to develop new capacities, to discover ways of knowing and navigating that you've been neglecting? What if the broken compass is forcing you to pay attention in new ways, to trust senses you've been ignoring, to find your way through relationship and intuition rather than measurement and certainty? You don't need to know exactly where you are right now. You don't need perfect clarity about your direction. You're not lost in a catastrophic sense. You're just navigating without your usual instruments, which means you have to pay attention more closely, trust yourself more deeply, be more present to subtle signs and signals. Rest in the uncertainty tonight. Let yourself not know. Let yourself be somewhere between lost and found, navigating by feel, trusting that you have capacities beyond your usual tools. The compass will break sometimes. That's not failure. That's life inviting you to find a different way, a deeper way, a way that connects you more intimately with the journey itself. You know more than you think you know. You can find your way even when you can't measure your position. Being lost is just another form of navigation, one that requires more attention, more presence, more trust. And sometimes, being lost leads you to places you never would have discovered if you had stayed on your carefully plotted course. Sleep now in the uncertainty. You don't need a compass to rest. You don't need to know where you are to be okay right here. Let yourself drift without reference points, trusting that you'll find your way when morning comes, not through certainty, but through attention, not through instruments, but through relationship with whatever each moment brings. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. There was a calligrapher named Setsuko who took great pride in her work. She would spend hours creating each character, each stroke perfect, each piece a work of art that she expected would last for generations. One day, she acquired a special ink that a merchant had brought from a distant province. The ink created beautiful deep blacks and flowed perfectly from her brush. But she soon discovered it had an unusual property. It never fully dried. Even days after she had finished a piece, the ink remained slightly wet. If you touched it, even carefully, it would smudge. At first, Setsuko was furious. She couldn't sell work that would smudge. She couldn't give pieces as gifts, knowing they would be ruined by the first careless touch. All her effort was going into work that couldn't be preserved. She tried everything to make the ink dry properly, but nothing worked. Finally, in frustration, She went to the merchant who had sold it to her, demanding her money back. The merchant looked surprised. But that's the nature of this ink. I told you it was special. Special? It's defective. It won't dry. Exactly, the merchant said. It's teaching ink. It reminds you that nothing you create is permanent. Your beautiful calligraphy will eventually fade, whether from age or damage or fire. This ink just makes the impermanence more obvious. Setsuko went home angry, but she couldn't stop thinking about the merchant's words. Everything she created would eventually be destroyed. The ink that wouldn't dry was just being honest about what was true of all her work. She began to approach her calligraphy differently. Instead of creating pieces meant to last forever, she started creating pieces meant for the moment. She would write on large papers and hang them in her studio, knowing they would slowly smudge and blur over time. She found this liberating. Each piece was perfect for now, and its eventual deterioration was part of its nature, not a tragedy. She began inviting people to come and breathe near her work, to let their breath slowly alter the still wet ink. The pieces became collaborations with time and circumstance, always changing, never fixed. I was trying to create permanent beauty, she told a student, but permanence doesn't exist. Everything changes. This ink taught me to make peace with that, to create beauty that's beautiful right now, without needing it to last forever. Tonight, what are you trying to make permanent that was always meant to change? What are you clinging to as if you could freeze it in time? Everything you love, everything you create, everything you are, it's all like ink that won't quite dry. Always shifting, always changing, always vulnerable to smudging. This isn't a tragedy. It's just the nature of existence. Let go of needing things to be permanent. Enjoy them while they're here. Create them knowing they'll change. Love them knowing they'll pass. The impermanence isn't the problem. Your fight against impermanence is. Rest now in the acceptance that nothing lasts forever, and that's what makes this moment precious. In a mountain monastery lived an old abbess named Ren, who kept in her private chamber an unusual mirror. The mirror was ancient, its surface darkened and worn until it reflected almost nothing. Visitors who saw it would often remark on its uselessness. "Your mirror shows nothing," they would say. "Why keep it? Get a new one that actually works." But Ren treasured this mirror and looked into it every morning. "It shows me exactly what I need to see," she would reply, though she never explained what she meant. One day, a vain young woman named Ayame came to the monastery seeking spiritual guidance. She was beautiful and knew it, spending hours each day on her appearance, constantly checking her reflection in every available surface. Her identity was completely wrapped up in her looks. During her first meeting with Ren, Ayame couldn't stop glancing at the darkened mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of herself. But the mirror showed nothing, just a dark, murky surface with barely a hint of reflection. "Your mirror is broken," Ayame said with annoyance. "Don't you want to see yourself?" "I see myself perfectly well in this mirror," Ren replied. "What do you see?" "Nothing. It's too dark." "Exactly," Ren said, and smiled. Ayame didn't understand, but as the days passed and she continued her stay at the monastery, she found herself repeatedly drawn to Ren's useless mirror. She would stand before it, searching for her reflection, finding almost nothing. It was deeply unsettling. Every other mirror showed her who she was, or at least showed her what she looked like. This mirror showed nothing. After a week, Ayami mentioned her frustration to Ren. "I hate your mirror. I keep looking into it hoping to see myself, but there's nothing there." "And what does that nothing teach you?" Ren asked. "That the mirror is broken." "Or that you're looking for the wrong thing," Ren suggested. "Every mirror you've ever looked into has shown you your face, your hair, your features. You've spent years studying that reflection, knowing exactly what you look like. My mirror can't show you that, so it forces you to consider, if you can't see your face, what else might you see? If appearance isn't available, what remains?" Ayami thought about this. When she looked into normal mirrors, she saw features she judged. Eyes too small, nose too sharp, skin not smooth enough. She saw an image she tried to perfect, control, improve. The looking was never really seeing. It was evaluating, criticizing, trying to manage how others would perceive her. But in Ren's dark mirror, there was nothing to evaluate, no features to judge, no appearance to control. Just dark surface and, if she looked very carefully, the barest hint of a form. Not details, just presence. "What do you see when you look in your mirror?" Ayami asked Ren. "Nothing that can be improved or criticized," Ren replied. "Nothing that age can diminish or beauty can enhance. Just the simple fact of being here, looking. The mirror that shows everything tempts you to judge what you see. The mirror that shows nothing releases you from judgment." She came to stand beside Ayame before the dark mirror. "Look at us now, standing here together. Can you see our faces?" "Barely," Ayame admitted. "Can you tell which of us is more beautiful?" "No." "Can you see our ages, our features, the details that usually define us?" "No." "Then we stand equal before this mirror," Ren said. "Not as beautiful or plain, young or old, but simply as two beings, present in this moment. The mirror that shows nothing strips away all the superficial ways we distinguish ourselves and leaves only the essential fact: we are here." Over the following weeks, Ayame found herself looking into Ren's mirror more than any of the clear mirrors in the monastery. At first, this puzzled her. Why would she choose the mirror that showed nothing? But gradually she understood. She was tired of the constant judgment that came with seeing her reflection clearly. Tired of always evaluating, always trying to improve, always wondering if she looked acceptable. The dark mirror gave her relief from all that. It let her be present without being perceived, even by herself. It let her exist without the burden of appearance. "I think I'm beginning to understand," Ayame told Ren one morning. "The mirror that shows nothing is actually showing me something very important. That I exist independent of how I look. That there's a me underneath or beyond appearance. I've spent so many years focused on my reflection that I forgot there's someone doing the looking." Ren nodded with satisfaction. "The mirror that shows everything directs your attention outward, to surface and appearance. The mirror that shows nothing directs your attention inward, to the awareness that's looking. One mirror shows you an object to be evaluated. The other mirror reveals you as a subject who is aware." She touched the darkened surface gently. "Most people think a mirror's value is in how clearly it reflects. But sometimes a mirror's greatest value is in what it doesn't show. The absence of reflection can teach what the presence of reflection never could. Ayame stayed at the monastery for 6 months, and during that time, her relationship with mirrors changed completely. She no longer felt compelled to check her reflection constantly. When she did look in clear mirrors, she no longer saw an image to be judged, but simply a face, no more or less significant than any other face. "Your dark mirror freed me," she told Ren when she prepared to leave. "I thought I needed to see myself clearly to know who I was, but actually, seeing myself clearly kept me trapped in appearance, in judgment, in the endless work of managing how I looked. Your mirror that showed nothing helped me discover the me that exists beyond appearance." After Ayame left, other students asked Ren about the mirror's teaching. "Why not just remove all mirrors?" one asked. "If the point is to free people from attachment to appearance, why have mirrors at all?" "Because running from mirrors is still being controlled by them," Ren explained. "The person who avoids all mirrors is as attached to appearance as the person who constantly looks. They're just attached to not looking rather than to looking. The dark mirror teaches something different. It teaches how to look without judgment, how to be aware of appearance without being enslaved by it." She held up the darkened mirror for the students to see. "This mirror shows that appearance and essence are not the same. The clear mirror shows you appearance so clearly that you might mistake it for essence. This dark mirror removes appearance and asks, what remains? What are you when you can't see your face? That question leads to wisdom." A philosophical student asked, "But isn't the dark mirror just another form of illusion? It hides reality rather than revealing it." "Does it?" Ren replied. "The clear mirror shows you how light reflects off your features at this particular moment from this particular angle. Is that reality? Or is that also just one kind of information, one kind of seeing? The dark mirror shows you something the clear mirror can't. Your existence independent of your reflection. Both mirrors have their uses. The question is whether you're wise enough to learn from each what it has to teach." Years later, when Ren was dying, she gave the darkened mirror to her successor with specific instructions. "Keep this mirror, even though students will mock it, even though visitors will offer to replace it. This mirror teaches what cannot be taught in words, that sometimes absence reveals more than presence, that sometimes nothing shows more than everything, that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from what we cannot see rather than from what we can." Tonight, as you rest, you might imagine looking into a mirror that shows nothing, not because the mirror is broken, but because it's teaching you something that clear mirrors never could. Without your reflection to evaluate and judge, what remains? Without your appearance to manage and improve, who are you? The mirror that shows nothing is inviting you to meet yourself beyond surface, beyond image, beyond all the ways you've learned to see yourself through others' eyes. In the dark mirror, there's just presence, just awareness, just the simple fact of being here without needing to look any particular way. Rest now in the dark mirror's teaching. Let yourself be unseen, unreflected, undefined by appearance. Let yourself exist in the space beyond image, where judgment can't reach, where evaluation has no meaning, where you simply are without needing to be any particular way. The mirror shows nothing, and in that nothing, everything essential is revealed. Sleep in that revelation tonight. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a famous garden known for its roses, there appeared one season a strange mutation, a rose bush with no thorns. The stems were completely smooth, the flowers beautiful, but there was no defense, no sharp points to protect the plant from being damaged. The gardener, a woman named Ayame, was fascinated by this thornless rose. She thought it was perfect, an improvement over regular roses. Who wouldn't want roses without thorns? Roses that you could handle freely, cut without care, and arrange without risk of being pricked. She took cuttings from the thornless rose and propagated them, creating a whole section of the garden filled with these defenseless plants. She was so proud of this achievement that she invited people from across the region to see her thornless roses. But within a few months, problems appeared. Deer, which usually avoided the thorny roses, ate the thornless ones freely. Insects that were discouraged by thorns colonized these plants without resistance. Careless visitors would grab handfuls of flowers, taking far more than they would have if thorns had made them cautious. Within a year, the thornless roses were struggling. They required constant human protection, constant intervention, constant care in ways that regular roses never needed. What had seemed like an improvement turned out to be a vulnerability, a visiting botanist explained to Ayame. The thorns weren't a flaw in the design. They were part of the wisdom of the design. The rose needs protection because it's beautiful and therefore desirable. The thorns say, "Appreciate me from a respectful distance. If you want my beauty, approach carefully with awareness. Without that protection, the rose is too vulnerable to survive." Ayame was defensive at first, but thorns hurt people. Wouldn't it be better to have roses without danger? Danger isn't the only reason for boundaries, the botanist replied. The thorns create an appropriate relationship. They don't prevent you from enjoying the rose. They just require you to be careful, to pay attention, to approach with awareness rather than grabbing carelessly. The thornless rose invites carelessness, and carelessness destroys it. Ayame began to see the thornless roses differently. What she had thought was an improvement was actually a mutation that made the plant unable to protect itself, and that inability to protect itself meant the plant couldn't thrive. She noticed similar patterns in human behavior. People who had no boundaries, no ability to say no, no thorns to protect themselves, often ended up depleted and taken advantage of. Like her thornless roses, they needed constant intervention to survive because they couldn't protect themselves naturally. "The thorns aren't cruel," she told visitors who still admired the thornless roses. "They're wisdom. They're the rose's way of teaching appropriate relationships. Approach with care. Take only what's offered. Respect the boundary between appreciation and consumption. The thornless rose can't teach this lesson, so it gets consumed." She stopped propagating the thornless mutation and let those plants live out their natural lifespan while caring for them extra carefully. When they eventually died, she didn't replace them. Her garden returned to thorny roses that could protect themselves. that invited careful appreciation rather than careless grabbing. Tonight, you might consider your own thorns, the boundaries you felt guilty about, the protections you've thought were unfriendly or unkind, the ways you've learned to say no, to keep an appropriate distance, to require others to approach you with care rather than carelessness. These aren't flaws, they're wisdom. They're what allow you to survive and thrive. Don't apologize for your thorns. They're part of your design, protecting what's most beautiful about you from being carelessly destroyed. In a monastery where monks practiced intensive meditation, there was a monk named Genzo, who struggled more than any of the others. While his fellow monks seemed to make progress, reporting experiences of insight and clarity, Genzo felt nothing but confusion and exhaustion. He tried so hard. He would sit in meditation until his legs ached and his back screamed. He would concentrate fiercely, trying to force his mind into the states he read about in the sutras. He would stay up late studying, trying to understand intellectually what he couldn't grasp experientially. But nothing seemed to work. While others reported breakthrough moments, sudden insights, and powerful experiences during meditation, Genzo just felt tired. So tired that he would sometimes fall asleep during meditation sessions, which filled him with shame. The other monks were achieving enlightenment, and he couldn't even stay awake. The monastery's teacher, Master Dogen, watched Genzo's struggle with patient concern. He saw how the young monk was wearing himself out, how the desperate striving was actually creating obstacles rather than removing them. One day after Genzo had fallen asleep during meditation yet again and woken up mortified, Dogen called him aside. "Genzo, you look exhausted. When did you last sleep a full night?" "I can't afford to sleep, Master. I'm so far behind the others. I need to practice more, not less." "Go to your room and sleep," Dogen said gently. "That's not a suggestion. It's an instruction. Sleep for as long as your body needs." Genzo was confused but obedient. He went to his room, lay down, and immediately fell into the deepest sleep he'd had in months. He slept through the afternoon, through the evening meditation, through the night, and into the next morning. When he finally woke, something was different. He couldn't name what had changed, but the world looked somehow clearer. The desperate striving that had consumed him was just gone. He felt a quietness inside that he'd never experienced before. He went to find Dogen, unsure what to say about this strange shift. "Master, something happened while I slept, but I don't know what. I feel different, but I didn't have any dramatic experience, any sudden insight. I just slept." Dogen smiled. "And in that sleep, you let go of trying. You let go of the desperate effort to achieve enlightenment. You stopped fighting with yourself. And in that letting go, what was always there became apparent." "But I didn't do anything," Genzo protested. "I just slept." "The others have profound experiences during meditation. I fell asleep." "Enlightenment isn't always dramatic," Dogen explained. "Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it comes not through effort, but through the cessation of effort. You've been trying so hard to wake up that you couldn't see you were already awake. You needed to sleep, to let go, to stop trying, for what's always been true to become obvious." Over the following days, Genzo noticed that the peace hadn't left him. It wasn't a dramatic altered state. It was more like a background quietness, a sense of okayness that didn't depend on circumstances. The desperate seeking was gone, not because he had found what he was looking for, but because he had realized he'd never lost it. Other monks asked him what had happened. "Did you have a breakthrough? A sudden awakening?" "I don't know," Genzo replied honestly. "I just slept. And when I woke up, something had shifted. But it wasn't like lightning striking. It was more like clouds clearing and realizing the sky had been there all along." Master Dogen used Genzo's experience to teach others. Many of you are waiting for dramatic enlightenment experiences. Thunder and lightning, profound insights, altered states. But enlightenment is often more subtle than that. It's the quiet recognition of what's always been true. It's the simple shift from trying to be at peace to noticing the peace that's already here. Years later, when Genzo told his story to students, he would laugh at his younger self. "I was trying so hard to wake up that I exhausted myself. I thought enlightenment was something to achieve through effort. But sometimes you have to stop trying to wake up and just let yourself sleep. Sometimes awakening comes through the door you're not watching." Tonight, stop trying so hard. Stop striving for perfect meditation or ideal relaxation or correct rest. Stop watching for enlightenment or breakthroughs or special experiences. Just sleep. Just let go. Just be tired and allow yourself rest without judgment. What you're seeking might come not through your effort, but through your willingness to stop efforting and simply be. Sleep through your own awakening if you must. It will be there when you wake. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. There was a farmer named Hideaki who worked his land diligently, waking before dawn and laboring until dusk. His son, Daichi, seemed to be his opposite, lazy, sleeping late, avoiding hard work whenever possible. Hideaki was ashamed of his son and frustrated by what he saw as wasted potential. "That boy will never amount to anything," Hideaki would complain to his neighbors. "I work myself to exhaustion while he lounges under trees and daydreams. He has no ambition, no drive, no sense of responsibility." The neighbors agreed with Hideaki's assessment. They saw Daichi as a disappointment, a young man who would never succeed because he lacked his father's work ethic. Some pitied Hideaki for having such a lazy son. Others judged Daichi harshly, predicting he would become a burden on his family and community. What no one knew, including Hideaki, was that Daichi spent his time under those trees observing. While appearing to do nothing, he was watching everything. How water moved across the land, which areas stayed moist, and which dried quickly, where wind patterns created microclimates, and how different plants thrived in different locations. Daichi was learning the land in ways his father, focused only on immediate work, never had. While Hideaki fought against the land's natural tendencies, trying to impose his will through hard labor, Daichi was learning to understand the land's own wisdom. One year, a severe drought struck the region. Hideaki worked harder than ever, carrying water to his crops, trying to save them through sheer effort. But most of his crops died anyway, as did the crops of other hard-working farmers. The drought was too severe for labor alone to overcome. But Daiichi, who everyone thought was lazy, quietly directed his efforts to the areas of the farm he knew, from his observations, retained moisture longest. He planted drought-resistant varieties in the driest areas. He used the natural wind patterns he had observed to create shade and reduce evaporation. He worked with the land's characteristics rather than against them. By the end of the season, Daiichi's sections of the farm had produced a modest but real harvest, while Hideaki's sections had produced almost nothing despite his exhausting efforts. Hideaki was stunned. "How did you do this? You barely worked compared to me." "I worked differently," Daiichi explained. "While you were laboring, I was learning. While you were fighting against the land, I was understanding it. My apparent laziness was actually observation. I was working, just not in ways that looked like work to you." He showed his father the subtle features of the land he had noticed, the slight depression that collected morning dew, the rock formation that created afternoon shade, the soil composition that retained moisture better than surrounding areas. "I learned all this by watching," Daiichi said, "by sitting still and paying attention rather than constantly moving and doing." Hideaki felt something shift in his understanding. He had been so focused on visible labor, on constant activity, on the appearance of hard work that he had never stopped to actually understand what he was working with. His son, whom he had judged as lazy, had been doing a different kind of work, the work of observation, understanding, and learning. "I'm sorry," Hideaki said. "I judged you without understanding what you were doing. I thought activity was the same as productivity, that visible effort was the same as effective effort. You were working all along, just in ways I didn't recognize as work." Word spread through the village about Daiichi's success during the drought. People who had judged him as lazy began to see him differently. Some felt ashamed of their premature conclusions. Others were curious about his methods. Daiichi began teaching other farmers what he had learned. He showed them how to read the land, how to observe rather than just labor, how to work with natural patterns rather than against them. The farmers who had once thought him lazy began to value his seemingly idle observation time. "I used to think you were wasting your life under those trees," one neighbor admitted. "Now I understand you were studying. You were learning in ways that look like laziness to people who don't understand what learning can be." A Zen monk who heard this story visited Daiichi. "You've learned an important lesson that many people never learn," the monk said. "You've learned that judging too quickly, based on appearances and conventional standards, often misses the truth. Your father judged you by how much visible labor you performed, but the quality of your outcomes proved that visible labor isn't the only measure of value." Daiichi nodded. "I learned something else too. I learned that what looks like laziness might be rest, or observation, or a different kind of work, and that what looks like hard work might be an inefficient struggle. Appearances are misleading, outcomes reveal truth." The monk smiled. "Your story reminds people not to judge too harshly or too quickly. The lazy son might be a careful observer. The apparently wasted time might be valuable learning. The story that seems simple at first viewing often has complexity that only reveals itself later." Years passed, and Daiichi became known as a wise farmer. though he still spent time sitting under trees, watching the land. His father, who had once been ashamed of him, now proudly told people, "My son taught me that there are many kinds of work, and the work that looks least like work is sometimes the most valuable." Hideaki learned to balance his own labor with periods of observation. He became a better farmer by incorporating some of his son's apparent laziness, taking time to watch and understand rather than constantly acting. One day, a young person came to Daiichi asking for advice. "My parents think I'm lazy because I spend time reading and thinking instead of working constantly. They say I'll never succeed. What should I do?" Daiichi smiled. "Keep reading and thinking, but also find ways to apply what you learn. Let your outcomes speak for you, not your appearance in the industry. My father thought I was lazy until he saw what I produced. Your parents will understand when they see the fruits of your different kinds of work." He paused, then added, "But also understand their perspective. To someone who values visible labor, observation looks like idleness. To someone who measures worth by constant activity, stillness looks like laziness. Don't judge them for judging you. Just prove through outcomes that your way has value too." The young person asked, "But what if I fail? What if my approach doesn't produce results?" "Then you learn and adjust," Daiichi replied. "I wasn't just sitting under trees doing nothing. I was observing, learning, thinking, and planning. If my approach had failed, I would have learned from that and tried something else." The point isn't that observation is always better than labor. The point is that judging approaches too quickly before seeing their outcomes often misses value. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider who you've been judging as lazy or unproductive. What if their stillness is observation? What if their rest is preparation? What if their apparent inactivity is actually a different kind of work that you don't recognize? And what about yourself? How harshly have you judged your own times of rest or stillness? Have you internalized the belief that only visible activity counts as work? Have you dismissed the value of observation, learning, thinking, and resting because these don't look like traditional labor? Not all work looks like work. Not all productivity is visible. Not all success comes from constant striving. Sometimes the lazy son who watches patiently sees what the hard-working father who never stops moving misses. Sometimes stillness achieves what activity cannot. Sometimes the full story only reveals itself long after the first judgment is made. Rest now without judging your rest. Let yourself be Daiichi under the tree, observing, learning, preparing in ways that might not look productive to outside observers, but that create real value. The lazy son wasn't lazy. He was doing a different kind of work. And so are you, even in this moment of apparent inactivity. Rest is work. Observation is productivity. Stillness is motion that hasn't revealed itself yet. Trust that the full story of your life will prove this, even if current appearances suggest otherwise. Sleep now, not lazy, but learning. Not inactive, but preparing. Not wasting time, but using it in ways that will only reveal their value when the drought comes, and your careful observation produces a harvest where frantic labor produced nothing. In a village where strong winds frequently blew down from the mountains, there was a grove of trees that included many different species. There were tall, rigid pines that stood straight and proud. There were sturdy oaks with thick trunks and strong branches. And among these impressive trees, there grew a single weeping willow, whose branches hung down gracefully, swaying with every breeze. A young carpenter named Riku would come to this grove to select wood for his work. He admired the strong, straight pines and the solid oaks. These were trees that stood firm against the wind, that didn't bend or yield, that maintained their position no matter what the weather came. This, Riku thought, was what strength looked like. The weeping willow he barely noticed, and when he did, he pitied it. Its branches drooped instead of reaching proudly skyward. It swayed and bent with every wind. It seemed weak, yielding, almost pathetic compared to the strong trees around it. Then one year, a great storm came. The wind howled down from the mountains with unprecedented force. The rain fell in sheets. Lightning split the sky. For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm raged. When it finally passed, Riku went to the grove to see what wood might be available from fallen trees. What he found shocked him. The strong pines, so tall and proud, had snapped like twigs. Their rigid trunks had broken under the force of the wind. The sturdy oaks had been uprooted, their strong but inflexible branches torn away. All across the grove lay the wreckage of trees that had stood firm, refused to yield, and had been destroyed for their rigidity. But the weeping willow still stood. Its branches, which had seemed so weak because they bent and swayed, had flexed with the wind rather than breaking against it. The tree that had appeared most fragile had survived when all the apparently strong trees had fallen. Riku sat beside the willow, looking at the destruction around it, trying to understand what he was seeing. Everything he thought he knew about strength was being challenged. The rig had broken. The yielding had survived. An old Buddhist nun named Kei was walking through the grove, surveying the damage from the storm. She saw Riku sitting in confusion and joined him. "The storm taught you something," she said. "I don't understand," Riku replied. "The strong trees broke. The weak ones survived. How can that be?" "You're confusing rigidity with strength," Kei said gently, "and flexibility with weakness. These are not the same things." She touched one of the willow's drooping branches. "This tree looks weak because it bends, but bending is what saved it." The rigid trees fought against the wind, trying to stand firm, refusing to yield. And the wind broke them. The willow didn't fight. It bent with the wind, yielded to forces it couldn't resist, and in that yielding, found the strength to survive. Riku listened carefully as Kei continued. "There's a principle in martial arts called Ju, which means gentleness or flexibility. The idea is that you don't meet force with force. You don't try to be harder than what's hitting you. Instead, you yield. You move with the energy coming at you. You redirect it rather than blocking it. This isn't a weakness. It's a different kind of strength." She gestured to the broken pines. These trees were strong in one way, but their strength was brittle. They could stand firm against normal winds, but when a force greater than their resistance came, they broke. The willow's strength is different. It has no brittleness because it has no rigidity. It can't break because it never stops bending. Over the following weeks, Riku began to see this principle everywhere. He watched how water, soft and yielding, could wear away stone over time. He noticed how the most rigid people in the village were often the most fragile when things didn't go their way. He observed how the people who could adapt and bend were often the ones who survived life's storms most intact. He changed his approach to carpentry. Instead of always seeking the hardest, most rigid woods, he began to appreciate woods with some flexibility, some give. He learned to work with the wood's natural tendencies rather than trying to force it into shapes it didn't want to take. His furniture became known for being both strong and graceful, able to bear weight while having a quality of flow and ease. But the deeper lesson was about how he lived his own life. Riku had always prided himself on being firm in his opinions, rigid in his principles, unwavering in his positions. He thought this made him strong, but he began to realize it made him brittle. When his wife suggested a different approach to something, his first instinct had always been to resist, to stand firm in his original idea. Now he began to consider, what if yielding wasn't losing? What if listening and adjusting weren't weaknesses but wisdom? When a client wanted changes to a piece he was building, instead of rigidly defending his design, he would flex, adapt, and incorporate their ideas. Often, the result was better than what he had planned. His yielding led to better outcomes than his resistance ever had. When life didn't go according to his plans, instead of fighting against reality, insisting things should be different, he began to bend with what was happening, to adapt, to find ways to work with circumstances rather than against them. A young man from the village came to Riku seeking advice. Everyone tells me I need to be strong, to stand firm, to never back down, but I don't feel strong when I do that. I feel brittle, like I'm about to break. Riku took him to see the weeping willow. The tree had grown even larger in the years since the storm, its graceful branches now spreading wide. This tree survived a storm that destroyed every tree around it, Riku said, not because it was harder or more rigid, but because it knew how to yield. Look at how it moves with this breeze. It doesn't fight the wind, it dances with it. He touched one of the branches, pulling it down and watching it spring back when he released it. True strength includes flexibility. The ability to bend without breaking, to yield without collapsing, to adapt without losing your essential nature. The willow yields, but it doesn't uproot. It bends, but it doesn't break. This is a strength that lasts. The young man asked, "But how do you know when to stand firm and when to bend? Don't some things require us to be rigid, to not yield?" "Yes," Riku acknowledged. "The willow has strong roots. It's flexible in its branches, but grounded in its foundation. The key is knowing what's essential and what's not. Your core values, your true nature, these are like the willow's roots. They ground you, but your opinions, your plans, your preferences, these can be like the branches. They can bend, adapt, yield without threatening who you fundamentally are." He gestured to where the oak and pine had once stood. These trees tried to keep everything rigid. Every branch, every position. They couldn't distinguish between what was essential to hold firm and what could be released. So when the great test came, they lost everything. The willow knew what to hold and what to release. It held its roots and released its branches to the wind. That's wisdom. Years later, the weeping willow became a teaching symbol in the village. Parents would bring children to see it, telling them the story of the great storm. Teachers would use it to illustrate the difference between rigidity and strength. Couples in conflict would sit beneath it, reminding themselves that yielding to each other wasn't losing, but creating a relationship that could weather storms. Riku, now an old man, would still visit the willow regularly. He had learned his lesson deeply. His life had brought many storms, many winds that could have broken him if he had stood rigid against them. But he had learned to bend, to yield, to move with forces he couldn't resist. And like the willow, he had survived, even thrived, not despite his flexibility, but because of it. One day, a master carpenter from the capital came to the village seeking Riku's advice. "I'm known for my rigid standards, my unwillingness to compromise," the master said. "But I'm miserable, and my relationships are all strained. People say I should learn from you." Riku took him to the willow. "What do you see?" "A tree with drooping branches. It looks weak." "It's the only tree that survived the great storm. Everything that looked strong broke. This tree that looks weak stood firm, not through rigidity, but through flexibility." He let this sink in before continuing. "Your rigidity feels like strength because you're in control, imposing your will, but it's actually brittleness. When life brings forces stronger than your will, you'll break. Learn to bend. Learn to yield. Not in your core principles, but in your attachment to having everything your way. True mastery includes knowing when to stand firm and when to flow." Tonight, as you rest, notice where you're holding rigid. What positions are you gripping too tightly? What plans are you clinging to that life is asking you to release? Where might you need to be more like the weeping willow, yielding to forces you can't control, bending so you don't break? Strength isn't always about standing firm. Sometimes it's about flowing with what comes. Sometimes the greatest power is in yielding, adapting, and moving with life, rather than against it. The willow survives because it doesn't fight battles it can't win. It bends, knowing that bending isn't breaking. Let yourself bend tonight. Let yourself yield to rest, to uncertainty, to whatever is. Don't be rigid in your expectations of how this should feel or what should happen. Flow like the willow's branches in the wind, trusting that your roots are strong enough to hold you even as you move with forces beyond your control. Yielding isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And tonight, it's the way to deep rest. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. In a coastal village where dangerous rocks lurked beneath the waves, there stood a lighthouse that had saved countless ships from destruction. The lighthouse keeper was a man named Tomo, who had tended the light faithfully for 20 years, never missing a night, never letting the beacon fail. Tomo took great pride in his work. Each evening as he lit the lamp, he would think about the ships that would see his light and know where the safe passage lay. He imagined grateful sailors steering clear of the rocks because of his vigilance. His purpose was clear, his contribution visible, his worth measured in ships that arrived safely rather than wrecking on the shore. But then came a period in Tomo's life when everything fell apart. His wife died after a long illness. His adult son, with whom he'd been close, moved to a distant city and rarely wrote. His closest friend in the village passed away suddenly. Within the span of 6 months, Tomo lost everyone who mattered most to him. He fell into a deep despair. He no longer felt the satisfaction he once had in his work. The lighthouse seemed meaningless, his life empty, his purpose hollow. He felt lost, as if he was stumbling through darkness with no light to guide him, no sense of direction, no hope that things would improve. Yet, despite his inner darkness, Tomo continued to light the lighthouse every night. It was a habit, a duty, the automatic continuation of what he had always done. But there was no joy in it anymore, no sense of meaning. He lit the lamp because that's what lighthouse keepers do, not because he felt it mattered. He would stand in the lamp room at night, watching the light sweep across the dark water, and think, I'm supposed to be the one providing light, but I'm drowning in darkness. I'm supposed to guide others to safety, but I'm completely lost in myself. What right do I have to stand here pretending to know the way when I can't find my own path? One stormy night, as Tomo stood in the lamp room feeling particularly hopeless, there was a knock at the lighthouse door. He descended to find a sailor, soaking wet, nearly hypothermic, who had been thrown from his ship when a wave swept over the deck. I saw your light, the sailor gasped as Tomo pulled him inside. I was in the water, being pulled toward the rocks. I thought I was going to die. Then I saw your light, and I swam toward it. Your light saved my life. Tomo brought the man warm clothes, hot tea, and blankets. As the sailor recovered by the fire, he kept repeating his gratitude. If your light hadn't been there, I would have been smashed against the rocks. I couldn't see anything else, but I could see your light. It showed me which way to swim. After the sailor left the next morning, rescued by his ship, which had returned looking for him, Tomo sat for a long time thinking about what had happened. He had been so focused on his own inner darkness that he had forgotten what his light actually did. It didn't require him to feel enlightened. It didn't need him to be free of darkness himself. It just needed to shine. The sailor didn't care that the lighthouse keeper was lost and grieving. The sailor didn't need Tomo to have all the answers or to be living a perfect life. The sailor just needed the light to be there, marking the safe passage, showing where the dangers were. A Zen monk who lived at the village had heard about the rescued sailor. He came to visit Tomo at the lighthouse. I've noticed you've been struggling, the monk said gently. Since your losses, I see the darkness in you. Tomo nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. I light this beacon every night, but I feel like a fraud. How can I guide others when I'm lost myself? How can I provide light when I'm full of darkness? The monk looked up at the lamp tower. Does the lighthouse need to understand navigation to be useful? Does it need to have sailed all the seas to show where the rocks are? Does it need to feel happy and fulfilled to save lives? No, Tomo admitted. It just needs to shine. Exactly, the monk said. You think your inner darkness disqualifies you from helping others, but actually, your willingness to keep the light burning despite your darkness makes your service even more valuable. You're not helping others because you have everything figured out. You're helping them because you do what needs to be done, regardless of how you feel. He touched Tomo's shoulder. Many people believe they can't help others until they're completely healed themselves. Until they've solved all their problems, found all their answers, achieved enlightenment or happiness or wholeness. But if everyone waited until they were completely well before helping others, no one would ever help anyone. We're all broken in some way. We're all stumbling in the darkness of one kind or another, but we can still hold lights for each other. Tomo felt something shift inside him. You're saying I can be lost and still guide others? You already are, the monk replied. You've been doing it every night. Your grief, your despair, your sense of being lost, none of that prevented the light from shining. None of that stopped you from doing what needed to be done. You think you're a fraud because you're suffering while helping others. But actually, you're demonstrating something important. Service doesn't require personal perfection. It requires showing up and doing what needs to be done. Over the following weeks, Tomo began to see his work differently. He was still grieving. He still felt lost much of the time. The darkness inside him hadn't disappeared. But he understood now that his inner state didn't invalidate his outer contribution. Ships still needed guidance. The light still saved lives. His pain didn't make the light less bright. He thought about all the people who probably felt as he did, broken, lost, inadequate, questioning their right to help others when they themselves were struggling. How many people stopped offering their gifts because they felt they weren't whole enough, healed enough, enlightened enough? A young woman from the village came to him one day troubled. She was training to be a healer, but felt overwhelmed by her own anxieties and doubts. How can I help heal others when I'm so broken myself? She asked. Tomo took her up to the lamp room and showed her the light. This lighthouse doesn't need to be whole to be useful. It just needs to do its job. You don't need to have conquered all your fears and healed all your wounds to help others. You just need to offer what you can offer. Your brokenness doesn't disqualify you from service. Sometimes it actually makes you better at it because you understand suffering from the inside. He told her about the sailor he had saved while feeling completely lost. The sailor didn't need me to be happy. He needed me to keep the light on. The people you help won't need you to be perfect. They'll need you to offer your skills, your compassion, your presence, whatever you're capable of giving. And you can give those things even while you're struggling. Word spread about the lighthouse keeper's teaching. People who had been holding back from helping others because of their own problems began to reconsider. The teacher who was battling depression realized she could still teach well, that her students didn't need her to be joyful, just knowledgeable and present. The counselor struggling with his own failed marriage recognized he could still help other couples, that his challenges didn't erase his insights. The mentor, dealing with doubt about his own life choices, saw that he could still guide younger people. That uncertainty about his own path didn't prevent him from illuminating options for others. Tomoe's grief gradually softened over time. Years passed, and while he never stopped missing his wife and feeling the absence of his son, the acute pain dulled into a quieter sadness. The darkness inside him became less consuming. But he never forgot the lesson of that period, that he had kept the light burning through his darkest time, that ships had been saved even while he felt lost, that his inner darkness hadn't stopped the outward light. One evening, many years later, an old sailor came to the lighthouse. "Do you remember me?" the sailor asked. "You saved my life 20 years ago. I was thrown overboard in a storm. I saw your light and swam to it." Tomoe did remember. That was the night I needed most to know that what I was doing mattered. Well, it mattered, the sailor said. I went on to have a family. 3 children, 7 grandchildren now. All of them exist because you kept that light burning. And you know what I learned that night? I learned that when you're drowning in darkness, you don't need someone who has all the answers. You just need someone who's holding a light, even if they're struggling to hold it, even if they're not sure why they're bothering. You just need the light. It doesn't matter if the keeper is lost. It matters that the light is there. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what lights you've been withholding because you feel too broken to offer them. What help have you refused to give because you don't feel qualified, whole, or enlightened enough? What guidance have you withheld because you yourself feel lost? You don't need to have everything figured out to help someone else. You don't need to be healed completely to offer healing. You don't need to be free of darkness to hold light for others. The lighthouse keeper's inner darkness didn't stop ships from being saved. Your inner struggles don't invalidate the contribution you can make. Keep your light burning, even in your dark nights. Not because you're perfect, but because someone out there is swimming in darkness toward whatever light they can find. Your light might be the one that saves them. And it doesn't matter that you feel lost. It only matters that you're still showing up, still doing what you can do, still offering what you can offer. Rest now in the understanding that you can be broken and still be useful, lost and still guide others, full of darkness and still provides light. The lighthouse doesn't need to understand the journey to mark the safe passage. It just needs to keep shining. So do you. Your inner darkness doesn't disqualify you from helping others. Sometimes it's what qualifies you most, because you understand what it's like to need a light in the darkness. Sleep now, lighthouse keeper, knowing that even in your darkest nights, your light has been saving lives. It always has been. It always will be. In a city famous for its artists, there was a renowned sculptor named Kaori who had created magnificent works for temples, palaces, and public squares throughout the land. She was known for her perfectionism, her unwillingness to declare any work complete until every detail was exactly right. At age 60, Kaori received a commission that she knew would be her masterpiece, a memorial sculpture for the city's founder. She had complete artistic freedom and unlimited time. This would be her legacy, the work by which all her other work would be judged. She began with intense focus, creating preliminary sketches, building models, and selecting the perfect stone. The first year was spent in planning. The second year is spent roughing out the basic form. By the third year, the sculpture was recognizably taking shape as a figure of dignity and strength, capturing something essential about leadership and vision. But as the sculpture neared completion, something strange happened. Kaori couldn't finish it. Every time she thought she was done, she would see another adjustment to make, another detail to refine, another element that wasn't quite right. The nose could be more precise, the hands could be more expressive, the drapery could flow more naturally. Years passed. The sculpture stood in her studio, nearly complete, but never quite complete enough. City officials would visit, would ask when they might see the finished work, and Kaori would assure them it was almost ready, just a few more refinements needed. 10 years after beginning the project, Kaori was still working on the same sculpture. It had gone through countless iterations. Areas she had refined years earlier, she would redo, claiming her skills had improved, and she could do better now. The sculpture had become an obsession, a project that consumed her life but never reached completion. A young sculptor named Isamu, who admired Kaori's earlier work, came to apprentice with her. He expected to learn from watching a master complete her masterpiece. Instead, he found an old woman trapped in endless refinement, unable to stop working on a sculpture that had been nearly done for years. "Why don't you declare it finished?" Isamu finally asked, after watching Kaori rework the same hand for the third time since he arrived. "Because it's not perfect yet," Kaori replied. "I can see the ideal form in my mind. This stone version still falls short. I need to keep working until the stone matches the vision." "But will it ever match?" Isamu asked gently. "Will the real sculpture ever match the perfect one in your imagination?" Kaori had no answer. She had never asked herself this question. She had always assumed that with enough work, enough refinement, enough time, she could make the physical sculpture match her mental ideal. A Zen teacher named Etsuko, who had known Kaori for decades, visited the studio. She looked at the nearly complete sculpture with a sad expression. "You're destroying it," Etsuko said. "I'm perfecting it," Kaori protested. "No, you're overworking it. The sculpture lost its life years ago when you couldn't stop refining it. Now it's becoming tight, over-controlled, anxious. I can see your perfectionism in every surface. The early spontaneity is gone, replaced by compulsive detail." She touched the sculpture gently. Completion doesn't mean achieving perfection. It means recognizing when continuing diminishes rather than improves. This sculpture was probably finished 5 years ago, but you couldn't see it because you were comparing it to an impossible ideal rather than accepting it as the real thing it actually was. Kaori wanted to argue, but she knew Etsuko was right. She looked at her sculpture with honest eyes for the first time in years. It was beautiful in parts, overworked in others. The areas she had refined most recently were actually worse than earlier versions. Too controlled, too fussy, too perfect. The sculpture had lost its breath somewhere along the way. "How do I know when something is done?" Kaori asked quietly. "How do I distinguish between stopping because it's complete and stopping because I've given up?" "You feel it," Etsuko replied. "True completion has a quality of rightness, even if the work isn't perfect. Giving up has a quality of defeat. But what you're doing now is neither completion nor giving up. It's compulsive continuation, working past the point where work helps. That's different from both completion and abandonment." She looked at Kaori directly. The sculpture should have been installed in the city square years ago, where people would appreciate it. Instead, it's trapped in your studio, being endlessly refined toward an ideal it will never reach. You're preventing it from serving its purpose because you can't accept that it's good enough. That's not dedication to excellence. That's fear disguised as perfectionism. This truth landed hard. Kaori realized she had been afraid to finish the sculpture, afraid to have it judged, afraid it wouldn't live up to her reputation. As long as it remained unfinished in her studio, it remained perfect in potential. Once completed and installed, it would be real, subject to criticism, limited by its actual qualities rather than protected by its imagined ones. "I've been hiding," Kaori admitted, "calling it refinement when actually it was avoidance." With Etsuko's help, Kaori looked at the sculpture one more time and made a decision. She declared it complete as it was, not perfect, but real. She stopped working on it and arranged for its installation. When the sculpture was finally revealed in the city square, public response was mixed. Some people loved it. Others thought it was good, but not as exceptional as they'd expected from a decade of work. Critics noted both its strengths and its weaknesses. It was not a perfect masterpiece. It was a good sculpture with both beautiful passages and overworked areas, a real work rather than an ideal one. And Kaori found unexpected peace in this. The sculpture was done, installed, serving its purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. It had moved from endless potential to limited actuality, and this movement was itself a kind of perfection. Not the perfection of flawless execution, but the perfection of genuine completion. "I spent 10 years trying to make it perfect," Kaori told Isamu, standing together, looking at the installed sculpture. "I should have spent 3 years making it good, and then accepted that good was enough. The extra 7 years didn't make it better. They just delayed it." Isamu asked, "But how will you know with your next work? How will you know when to stop?" "I'll try to recognize when I'm working from love versus working from fear," Kaori said. "When I'm working from love, I'm responding to the actual piece, helping it become itself. When I'm working from fear, I'm trying to make it match an impossible ideal, trying to protect myself from criticism or judgment. The work from fear doesn't improve the piece. It just makes it tighter, more controlled, more dead." She touched a rough area of the sculpture that she had always intended to smooth further. "See this? For years I planned to refine it, but now I see it gives texture, life, contrast. My perfectionism wanted to eliminate it, but actually it's one of the better parts. Sometimes what we think is incomplete is actually just real, and real includes roughness, includes elements that don't match the ideal." In her remaining years, Kaori created several more sculptures, and each one she completed more quickly than the last. She learned to recognize the moment when a work was done, not perfect, but complete. She learned that completion meant allowing the work to be what it actually was, rather than endlessly pushing it toward what it might ideally be. "My final work taught me that sometimes completion means stopping, not finishing," she told students. "Sometimes good enough is actually excellent, because continuing would diminish rather than improve. Sometimes the work is done when you can let it go, not when it's perfect." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what in your life needs completion rather than more refinement. What projects, relationships, phases, identities have you been endlessly working on, unable to declare them finished because they don't match your ideal? What would it mean to accept them as complete, as good enough, as done? Completion doesn't require perfection. It requires recognition that continuing is no longer serving the work or serving you. It requires courage to let the real thing exist, rather than protecting the imagined perfect thing by keeping it perpetually incomplete. Rest now in completion. Let yourself be done with some things, not because they're perfect, but because they're finished. Let yourself stop refining and start living with what actually is, rather than what might ideally be. The sculptor's final work teaches that holding on too long destroys as surely as letting go too early. Learn to recognize the difference, and then, when it's time, let go. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. There was a master calligrapher named Kenzo who had spent 40 years perfecting his craft. He could write each character with flawless precision, every stroke exactly as the ancient masters had prescribed. His work was technically perfect, exhibited in galleries, and purchased by collectors who valued his adherence to classical standards. But Kenzo had a secret dissatisfaction. Despite the praise and recognition, his work felt lifeless to him. Each piece was an exercise in replication, a demonstration of technique, but nothing more. He was copying perfection that had been established centuries ago, adding nothing of himself, discovering nothing new. One day, an important patron commissioned a piece for a temple dedication. The character to be written was Mu, meaning emptiness or void. Kenzo prepared carefully, mixing his ink to exactly the right consistency, selecting his finest brush, and setting up his workspace with meticulous attention to every detail. He had practiced this character thousands of times. He knew exactly how it should look. He visualized every stroke in his mind, preparing to execute it perfectly. But as he positioned his brush above the paper, his cat, who normally slept quietly in the corner during his work, suddenly leapt onto the table. The cat's paw hit Kenzo's arm just as he was beginning the first stroke. The brush dragged across the paper in a completely unintended direction, creating a wild, irregular mark that bore no resemblance to proper calligraphy. Kenzo's first reaction was anger. The perfect paper was ruined. Hours of preparation wasted. He would have to start over, and he was already behind schedule. He grabbed the ruined piece, intending to crumple it and throw it away, but something made him pause. He looked at the mark more carefully. The stroke was wild, yes, completely improper by classical standards. But it had an energy, a life, a spontaneous quality that none of his careful, perfect strokes ever achieved. It looked like emptiness, like void, like the very essence of Mu, in a way his technically correct versions never had. The mark captured something real about emptiness, its unpredictability, its resistance to control, its indifference to our intentions. His planned perfect versions had been illustrations of the concept. This accidental mark was somehow the thing itself. Kenzo sat staring at this mistake for over an hour. Finally, he decided to build the rest of the character around it, incorporating the wild stroke instead of starting over. The final piece was unlike anything he had ever created. It combined his technical skill with this element of pure accident, planned mastery with unplanned spontaneity. When he delivered the piece to his patron, he apologized. "I must confess, this isn't what I planned. My cat interfered, and the first stroke went completely wrong. I tried to salvage the piece, but it's not traditional calligraphy. I understand if you want me to create a new one." The patron studied the work in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, "This is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's wrong," Kenzo protested. "The first stroke violates every principle of proper form." "It's alive," the patron replied. Your other work is beautiful, technically flawless, but it's like looking at a preserved flower. This piece is like seeing a flower growing wild. It has breath in it, spontaneity, the quality of something happening right now rather than being carefully reconstructed from the past. He hung the piece in the temple, and people came from across the region to see it. Other calligraphers studied it, trying to understand how Kenzo had achieved such vitality. Some tried to recreate the effect by deliberately making mistakes, but these forced accidents never had the same quality. The life in Kenzo's piece came from the genuineness of the accident, not from calculated imperfection. A Zen master who viewed the piece said to Kenzo, "Your cat understood something you had forgotten, that true art comes from responding to the moment, not from executing a plan. For 40 years, you've been copying the past. In one moment of accident, you created something present." "But I can't plan accidents," Kenzo said. "I can't make this happen deliberately." "Exactly," the master replied. "That's why it worked. Your planning mind, your control, your perfection, all of that had to be interrupted for something real to emerge. The cat was your teacher." From that day forward, Kenzo's approach to calligraphy changed. He still practiced technique, still maintained his skills, but he stopped trying to control every aspect of the outcome. He began leaving space for accident, for the unexpected, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom. Sometimes he would start a piece without complete preparation, letting the consistency of the ink vary, allowing the paper to be slightly wrinkled, welcoming small imperfections. Sometimes he would work faster than was comfortable, not giving himself time to calculate every movement. Sometimes he would deliberately do something unusual, breaking a rule to see what would happen. Not every piece succeeded. Many experiments failed, but the successful pieces had a quality his earlier perfect work had lacked: presence, immediacy, life. They felt like they were happening rather than being displayed. They invited the viewer into an experience rather than presenting a completed achievement. Other calligraphers criticized this departure from classical standards. Kenzo has abandoned proper technique, they said. He's making mistakes deliberately. This isn't true calligraphy. But Kenzo understood something they didn't. Technique wasn't being abandoned. It was being liberated. He had spent 40 years building technical mastery. Now he was learning what to do with that mastery, not to control and perfect, but to create conditions where truth could emerge spontaneously. The technique serves spontaneity, he would tell students. You practice until the movements are natural, until you don't have to think about them. Then you let go of trying to be perfect and allow something real to happen. The years of practice give you the skills. The letting go gives you the art. One student asked, "But how do you know when to let go? How do you know when you've practiced enough?" "You don't," Kenzo admitted. "I practiced for 40 years before my cat taught me to let go. Maybe that was too long. Maybe it wasn't long enough. The point isn't reaching some perfect amount of preparation. The point is remaining open to the moment when control needs to give way to spontaneity." He showed the student his temple piece with its wild first stroke. "I could never recreate this exactly. I could make similar pieces, but this particular mark came from this particular moment of accident. That's what makes it true. It's not a reproducible technique. It's a response to what actually happened. Years later, when Kenzo was old, he was asked to demonstrate calligraphy for the emperor. It was considered a great honor. Most calligraphers prepared extensively for such occasions, practicing for weeks to ensure a perfect demonstration. Kenzo prepared differently. He practiced just enough to be warmed up, then went to the demonstration with no fixed plan. He would respond to the moment, to the energy in the room, to whatever impulse arose. It was terrifying and exhilarating. As he stood before the emperor with brush and paper, he felt all his years of perfect control wanting to take over. The safe thing would be to execute a flawless classical piece. But instead, he paused, breathed, and let go of control. What emerged was neither perfectly planned nor completely accidental. It was something in between, technique meeting moment, skill dancing with spontaneity, the practiced hand responding to the unpracticed impulse. The character he created had both mastery and wildness, both tradition and innovation. When he finished, the emperor was silent for a moment, then said, "I have seen many demonstrations of perfect technique. This is the first time I've seen calligraphy that felt alive. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider where you're over-controlling, over-planning, and trying to perfect everything before you act. What would happen if you made space for accident, for spontaneity, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom? What if your careful plans are actually preventing something more true from emerging?" The perfect mistake teaches that life isn't lived according to plan. The most authentic moments come when planning gives way to presence, when control releases into response, when the prepared hand meets the unprepared moment. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need perfect execution. You need technique in the service of spontaneity, skill as a foundation for letting go. Rest now in the space between planning and accident, between control and release. Let yourself be like Kenzo's brush, prepared by practice, but freed from the need to be perfect. Tomorrow might bring a cat leaping onto your carefully prepared plans. Let it. The interruption might be the teacher. The accident might be the truth. The mistake might be perfect. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. In a village known for pottery, there lived a potter named Masao who had studied for decades under the greatest masters. He created bowls, cups, and vessels of exceptional quality, each piece perfectly formed, perfectly glazed, perfectly fired. His work was sought after by tea masters and collectors, and he took enormous pride in never releasing a flawed piece. Any pot that emerged from the kiln with even the slightest imperfection, Masao would destroy immediately. A hairline crack, an uneven glaze, a slight asymmetry, these were intolerable failures in his eyes. His studio floor was littered with shards of pieces that hadn't met his exacting standards. One day, Masao created a tea bowl for the most important commission of his life. The provincial governor had requested a ceremonial bowl for an upcoming tea gathering with the emperor. Masao worked on this bowl for weeks, preparing the clay with unusual care, forming it with absolute precision, applying the glaze with perfect evenness. When he opened the kiln after firing, his heart sank. The bowl was magnificent in form, perfect in proportion, beautiful in color. But there, running from the rim down the side, was a crack. Not a dramatic break, but a fine line that compromised the bowl's perfection. Masao's first instinct was to smash it immediately, as he did with all flawed work. But the deadline was close, and he had no time to create another bowl of this quality. He sat staring at the cracked bowl, torn between his standards and his practical needs. Finally, he decided to show it to the governor and explain the situation, offering to work day and night to create a replacement. When he presented the bowl and apologized for its flaw, the governor examined it carefully. "This crack," the governor said, tracing it with his finger. "It's interesting. It adds something to the piece. It makes it unique." "It makes it flawed," Masao protested. "A tea bowl should be perfect. This crack means the bowl could fail, could break apart entirely. It's a structural weakness." "Or it's a story," the governor replied. "This bowl is telling us something, that even in our most careful efforts, nature has its own say. The fire does what it will. The clay responds according to its own nature. Your perfect technique met forces beyond your control, and this crack is the conversation between them." He held the bowl up to the light. "I think I'll use this bowl for the emperor's tea." A perfect bowl says nothing except, "Look how skilled the potter is." This bowl says something more interesting. "Look how skill and accident can create something neither could create alone." Masao was unconvinced but had no choice. The governor kept the cracked bowl. On the day of the emperor's visit, Masao attended the tea ceremony, anxious about his flawed work being used in such an important context. The emperor held the bowl, examining it from every angle. He paused at the crack, running his thumb along it thoughtfully. Masao held his breath, certain his reputation was about to be destroyed. "This crack," the emperor said finally, "is the most honest thing in this entire ceremony. Everything else is pretending to be perfect. The precise movements, the practiced words, the carefully arranged flowers. But this bowl admits it's not perfect. It shows its vulnerability. And in doing so, it invites us to be real rather than ceremonial." He looked directly at Masao. "Did you make this crack deliberately?" "No, Your Majesty," Masao admitted. "It's a flaw. I almost destroyed the bowl because of it." "Then it's a gift," the emperor replied. "A deliberate crack would be pretentious, a manufactured authenticity. But this crack happened. The bowl is showing us the truth of its making, that fire and clay have their own will, that perfection is an illusion, that beauty can include what we consider flaws." After the ceremony, a renowned tea master approached Masao. "That bowl is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's cracked," Masao said, still unable to accept this interpretation. "Exactly," the tea master replied. "Your perfect bowls are impressive but distant. They're so perfect they feel inhuman, unreal. But this bowl with its crack is approachable. It's marked by the actual process of its creation. It doesn't pretend to be more than what it is, clay and glaze and fire meeting imperfectly." He held the bowl carefully. "In the tea ceremony, we value wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. Your perfect bowls violate wabi-sabi. They're trying too hard to be permanent, complete, perfect. This cracked bowl embodies wabi-sabi perfectly. It shows age before it's even been used. It admits its fragility. It's honest. Over the following weeks, Masao struggled with this new perspective. His entire career had been built on the pursuit of perfection, on the elimination of flaws. Now he was being told that his flawed bowl was his finest work precisely because of its flaw. He began to experiment. He still created bowls with his full skill and attention, but he stopped destroying pieces that emerged with cracks, asymmetries, or irregularities. He studied these flawed pieces, trying to understand what made some flaws interesting and others merely defects. He discovered something subtle. There were flaws that came from carelessness or poor technique, and these did diminish the work. But some flaws came from the honest interaction of materials and fire, and these often added something that perfect technique alone could never achieve. The cracked bowl became famous. Tea masters throughout the region requested pieces from Masao that had this quality of honest imperfection. He became known not for perfect bowls, but for bowls that told the truth of their making, that showed the conversation between intention and accident, control and surrender. "I spent 30 years trying to eliminate every flaw," Masao would tell students who came to learn from him. "I thought my job was to impose my will perfectly on clay and fire. But actually, my job is to create conditions and then allow the fire to have its say. The crack in that bowl taught me that some of what I called flaws were actually the fire's contribution to the work. I was rejecting collaboration, insisting on control. The crack showed me a better way." He would show students two bowls, one perfect by traditional standards, one marked by a crack or asymmetry. Which is more beautiful? The answer depends on what you value. If you value technical mastery and perfect execution, choose the perfect bowl. If you value honesty and the authentic marks of process, choose the cracked one. Neither is wrong, but I wasted decades making only one kind of bowl because I couldn't see value in the other. A young potter asked, "So should we try to make flawed pieces? Should we create cracks deliberately?" "No," Masao replied firmly. "Deliberate cracks are dishonest, just a performance of imperfection. Do your best work, use your full skill and attention, then accept what emerges, including the flaws. Some flaws you'll need to recognize as failures, results of inattention or poor technique that you can learn from. But some flaws you'll need to recognize as gifts, contributions from forces beyond your control that add something you couldn't have planned." He held up the famous cracked bowl, now aged and stained from years of use. "This bowl has served the emperor and countless tea masters. The crack never caused it to fail. Instead, the crack gave it character, made it memorable, and allowed it to teach something that perfect bowls never could. What I considered its fatal flaw was actually its finest feature." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider your own cracks, your own flaws, the things about yourself or your life that don't meet your standards of perfection. What if some of these aren't failures but features? What if what you consider your greatest weakness is actually adding something that strength alone never could? The cracked bowl served perfectly. Its flaw didn't prevent it from holding tea. It enhanced its ability to hold meaning. Your flaws might work the same way. They might not prevent you from serving your purpose. They might deepen it, make it more honest, more relatable, more real. Rest now in acceptance of your cracks. Not every imperfection is a gift, but some are. Not every flaw adds value, but some do. The question isn't whether you're perfect. You're not, and you never will be. The question is whether your imperfections are honest marks of your making, authentic results of your interaction with forces beyond your control. Those kinds of flaws don't diminish you. They complete you. The potter's cracked bowl teaches that perfection isn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal is authenticity, honesty, and the willingness to show the truth of your process, including its imperfections. Sleep now as a cracked bowl, flawed but functional, imperfect but honest, broken in ways that somehow make you more whole. In a village rebuilding after a great earthquake, there was a master mason named Takeo who was known throughout the region for building walls that followed precise specifications. Every stone placed according to traditional methods, every measurement exact, every joint perfect. His walls were architectural achievements, admired by other masons and praised in the capital. When the earthquake struck and buildings collapsed throughout the region, everyone expected Takeo's walls to stand as a testament to proper craftsmanship. Instead, most of his carefully built walls fell. The perfect joints fractured. The precisely placed stones tumbled. All that meticulous work reduced to rubble. But there was one wall that remained standing, and it puzzled everyone. It was a wall that Takeo's apprentice, a young man named Jiro, had built in the early days of his training. The wall wasn't straight. It curved and bent in unusual ways. The stones weren't uniform or perfectly fitted. By every standard of proper masonry, the wall was wrong. Takeo had been embarrassed by it, had planned to tear it down and rebuild it properly, but had never gotten around to it. Now that the crooked, imperfect wall stood while all of Takeo's masterpieces lay in ruins. After the earthquake, people would visit that wall, marveling at how something so improperly built had survived when everything correct had fallen. Takeo was humbled and confused. He went to examine the crooked wall carefully, trying to understand what accidental wisdom it contained. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about his craft. The wall's curves and bends, which he had seen as flaws, had actually allowed it to flex during the earthquake, rather than rigidly resisting the force. The imperfect joints had given the structure some ability to shift without completely fracturing. The irregular stones had created a kind of organic stability that precise, uniform stones couldn't achieve. "I built this wall wrong," Jiro said when he and Takeo examined it together. "I was new. I didn't know the proper methods yet. I just placed stones in ways that felt stable." "You built it intuitively," Takeo replied slowly, "while I built with rigid adherence to rules. Your intuition understood something about forces and flexibility that the traditional methods don't account for. The rules made sense for normal conditions, but they weren't designed for extreme stress. Your ignorance of the rules allowed you to respond to the actual needs of the situation." An engineer from the capital came to study the surviving wall. He measured its curves, examined its composition, and tried to understand its principles. "This wall shouldn't have stood," he said finally. "By every calculation, every principle of proper construction, it should have fallen. But clearly, our principles are incomplete. This wall knows something we don't." Takeo spent months studying not just Jiro's wall, but other structures that had survived. he found a pattern. The buildings that stood weren't always the ones built most correctly. Often, they were the ones with irregular features, with imperfections that accidentally created flexibility. The traditional methods, designed over centuries for stable conditions, weren't necessarily best for extreme conditions. He began incorporating these insights into his new work. He still used traditional methods as a foundation, but he added intentional irregularities, curves instead of straight lines, flexible joints instead of rigid joints of rigid ones, and organic shapes instead of perfect geometry. Other masons criticized him. "You're violating the principles," they said. "You're building incorrectly." "I'm building for survival rather than for appearance," Takeo replied. The old principles were based on aesthetic ideals and normal conditions. "I'm building for abnormal conditions based on what actually survived when everything else fell." His new walls looked less impressive than his old ones. They weren't as straight, as precise, as aesthetically pleasing. But when another earthquake struck years later, these walls stood. The traditional walls, built by masons who still adhered to the old, correct methods, fell again. Takeo's irregular, imperfect walls flexed and bent and survived. "What's more important?" Takeo asked his critics. "Building correctly according to traditional standards, or building what actually works?" "My old walls were perfect and dead. My new walls are imperfect and alive." He trained a new generation of masons in what he called flexible building. They learned the traditional methods, but also learned when to deviate from them, when to trust intuition over rules, and when to value survival over correctness. "The crooked wall saved my life," Takeo would tell students. Not just physically, by remaining standing during the earthquake, but professionally and spiritually, by taught me that correctness isn't the same as truth. Something can be done exactly right according to established principles and still fail when conditions change. And something can be done wrong and still succeed because it responds to actual conditions rather than theoretical ideals. One student asked, "So should we ignore all the traditional methods?" "No," Takeo replied. "Learn them, understand them, but don't worship them. Rules are tools, not truths. They work until they don't. The crooked wall taught me to pay attention to what actually works, rather than what should work according to theory. Sometimes the imperfect, the irregular, the supposedly wrong thing contains wisdom that perfection misses." He would take students to see Jiro's wall, still standing decades after the earthquake that revealed its value. "This wall is a better teacher than any master mason," he would say. "It teaches that survival often comes from flexibility rather than rigidity, from imperfection that allows adaptation rather than perfection that allows no variation. It teaches that what's wrong by one standard might be right by a more important standard." The wall became something of a shrine. People would visit it, touch it, and remember that sometimes what appears to be failure or imperfection is actually hidden success. That correctness and effectiveness aren't always the same thing. That rules have limits, and intuition has wisdom. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the crooked walls in your life, the things you've done imperfectly, irregularly, against the rules or proper methods. Perhaps these apparent flaws are actually what allowed you to survive when others who did everything correctly fell apart. Perhaps your imperfections are flexibilities that rigid perfection lacks. You don't have to do everything correctly. You don't have to follow every rule or meet every standard. Sometimes the crooked wall stands when the straight wall falls. Sometimes your irregular, imperfect, supposedly wrong way of doing things is actually what works best for the conditions you're actually in, rather than the ideal conditions that rules assume. Rest now in acceptance of your crooked walls. They may not look perfect. They may not meet conventional standards, but they've kept you standing when straight walls would have crumbled. Your imperfections aren't failures. They're flexible, and flexibility is what allows survival when everything rigid breaks. The crooked wall knows this. Now you know it too. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. In the capital city lived a tea master named Soho, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. His movements were flawless, his timing exact, his aesthetic sense refined beyond what most people could achieve in several lifetimes. Every detail of his ceremonies was considered and precise. The angle of the bowl, the temperature of the water, the moment to pass the tea, the positioning of each implement. Soho's ceremonies were legendary. People would wait years for an invitation to attend. Wealthy patrons offered fortunes to have Soho perform ceremonies for their guests. Other tea masters studied his techniques, trying to replicate his perfection. But Soho himself had grown troubled. Despite his technical mastery, despite the acclaim, he felt his ceremonies had become performances rather than genuine expressions of tea mind. He was so focused on executing each movement perfectly that he had lost connection to the spirit beneath the movements. His ceremonies were flawless, but somehow empty. On his 70th birthday, Soho decided to retire from public ceremonies. He would perform one final tea ceremony, a farewell to his long career, and then step away to live simply in a small temple. He prepared meticulously for this final ceremony. He invited only his closest students and a few respected elders who had followed his work for decades. He selected implements he had used for years, choosing each for its history and meaning. He practiced the movements daily in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, ensuring everything would be perfect. The day of the ceremony arrived. Soho entered the tea room with his usual grace, began with his usual precision. His guests watched in respectful silence, knowing they were witnessing a master's final performance. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. As Soho reached for the tea bowl, his hand trembled slightly. Whether from age, emotion, or simple nervousness, he couldn't say. The tremor caused him to fumble the bowl. It didn't fall or break, but his grip was clumsy, his movement awkward. The flow of the ceremony was disrupted by this imperfect moment. Soho's first instinct was mortification. After 50 years of perfect execution, his final ceremony was marred by a clumsy mistake. But then something shifted in him. The mistake had broken his focus on perfection, and in that break, he suddenly felt present in a way he hadn't been during a ceremony in years. He picked up the bowl, not with perfect grace, but with simple honesty, with the actual movement of an old man holding a bowl. He continued the ceremony, but something had changed. He was no longer performing perfectly. He was just making tea, sharing tea, being present with his guests. The movements that followed weren't as technically flawless as usual, but they had a quality his perfect performances had lacked. They were real. They were Soho actually being here, making tea, connecting with his guests, rather than Soho executing a perfect reproduction of the tea master role. When the ceremony ended, there was a long silence. Then one of the elder guests spoke. "That was the finest tea ceremony I have ever experienced." Soho was confused. "But I made mistakes. The execution wasn't clean." "The execution was finally clean," the elder replied. "Clean of performance, clean of ego, clean of the need to be perfect. For the first time in decades, I saw you actually making tea rather than demonstrating how tea should be made. Your fumble was the most important moment of the ceremony. It dropped you out of performance and into presence." Another guest agreed. "I've attended 6 of your ceremonies over the years. They were all technically superior to today's, but this one touched me in a way the others never did. The imperfection made it human. It made it real. It made it about tea rather than about perfection." Soho sat with this feedback for a long time. He realized that his 50-year pursuit of perfect execution had taken him away from genuine expression. He had become so skilled at performing the tea ceremony that he had forgotten how to simply make tea with presence and care. "I thought mastery meant perfect execution," Soho told his students later. "I thought the goal was to perform each movement so exactly that no flaw could be found. But that kind of mastery is dead. It's impressive but not alive. Today, when I fumbled and had to let go of perfection, I finally rediscovered what tea ceremony is actually about. Presence, connection, the simple act of sharing tea with other humans." He looked at his hands, still slightly trembling. "These old hands that made a mistake taught me more than 50 years of perfect practice. They taught me that perfect execution becomes perfect only when you stop trying to perfect it, when you let go of performance and sink into presence." One student asked, "So should we not practice? Should we not work toward technical excellence?" "Practice," Soho replied. "Develop your technique. But don't let technique become an end in itself. Practice until the movements are natural, then let go of trying to perform them perfectly. Use your technique to support presence, not to replace it. Master the form so completely that you can forget the form and just be here, making tea." He picked up a tea bowl, holding it with the same slight tremble. "See this imperfection? This is actually perfection because it's real. It's an old man's hand actually holding a bowl. The steady, flawless grip I cultivated for decades was impressive, but it was also a kind of lie it hid my actual hand behind a perfect performance. This trembling hand is honest, and honesty is more important than perfection." In the weeks following his final ceremony, Soho began making tea in a completely different way. He still had all his technical skills, all his aesthetic sensitivity, but he used them lightly, allowing imperfection, welcoming the unexpected, staying present with what was actually happening rather than executing a mental script. He made tea for strangers, for children, for anyone who wanted to share a bowl. These weren't formal ceremonies with guests and perfect settings. They were just tea, made with care, shared with presence. and people felt more touched by these simple offerings than they had by his legendary perfect ceremonies. "You've become a greater tea master by letting go of mastery," one visitor observed. "I've become an actual tea master by letting go of the performance of mastery," Soho clarified. "I was skilled before, but I wasn't real. Now I'm both skilled and real. The skill supports the reality rather than replacing it. That's the difference." A young tea student struggling to perfect his own technique asked Soho for guidance. "How do I know when my practice is good enough? When can I stop trying to perfect my movements? When perfection becomes a barrier rather than a path," Soho replied. "Practice until the movements are natural and trustworthy. Then let go of trying to make them perfect and just let them be. The movement from practice to performance to presence, that's the journey. Most people stop at performance, endlessly perfecting their execution. The final step is letting go of perfection and discovering presence." He made tea for the young student, his hands moving with practiced skill, but also with slight tremors, small imperfections, human reality. "See how I make tea now? I'm not performing or demonstrating, I'm just making tea. The years of practice allow me to do it well, but letting go of perfection allows me to do it truly. Both are necessary, but the second is what makes it complete. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you've been perfecting, performing, trying to execute flawlessly. What would happen if you let your hands tremble slightly? If you allowed imperfection? If you stopped performing mastery and just did the thing itself, present and real? Perfect execution is impressive, but presence is what actually connects, what actually matters, what actually makes any practice complete. You've practiced enough. You've refined enough. Now it's time to let go of perfection and discover what's on the other side. Not sloppiness, not carelessness, but genuine presence that includes both skill and imperfection, both mastery and humanity. Rest now in this completion. Let yourself fumble slightly. Let yourself be real rather than perfect. The Tea Master's Last Cup teaches that the journey ends not in flawless execution, but in authentic presence. You've arrived, not at perfection, but at something better, yourself, skilled and real, doing what you do with care and presence, and the slight tremble of actual human hands. That's perfection. That's the completion. That's the teaching. Sleep now, no longer performing, just being. This is enough. You are enough. The perfect becomes perfect when you stop trying to perfect it. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. In a valley between two mountain ranges, there was a river that confused everyone who saw it. Most rivers in the region flowed from high elevations to low, following gravity as rivers should. But this river appeared to run uphill, flowing from what looked like lower ground to higher ground, defying logic and nature. The villagers argued about the river for generations. Some said it was cursed, that supernatural forces made it run backwards. Others insisted it was an optical illusion, that the river only appeared to run uphill but actually didn't. A few claimed the river was evidence of magic in the world, proof that natural laws could be suspended. A scholar named Fumiko came to study the peculiar river. She was a woman who trusted observation over superstition, who believed that understanding came from careful study rather than easy assumptions. She spent weeks walking the river's length, taking measurements, making careful notes. What she discovered was unexpected. The river wasn't running uphill at all, though it certainly appeared to be. The optical illusion was created by the unusual topology of the valley. The way surrounding hills created a visual context that made lower ground appear higher and higher ground appear lower. When you adjusted for this visual distortion and looked at actual elevations, the river was flowing downhill as it should, following gravity perfectly. But there was a second discovery, more interesting than the first. There was a short section where the river actually did flow uphill, pushed by an underground spring with such force that it created a brief reversal of normal flow before gravity took over again. This wasn't magic or curse, it was hydrology, underground pressure overcoming gravity temporarily, a natural phenomenon that looked miraculous only because people didn't understand the forces involved. Fumiko shared her findings with the villagers, explaining the optical illusion and the underground spring. Some villagers were relieved to have the mystery explained. Others were disappointed. They had preferred the magical explanation to the scientific one. But an old farmer named Gonji said something that made Fumiko reconsider what she thought she'd discovered. "The river teaches something important," Gonji said. "It teaches that things can look completely wrong while being completely right. That what appears to violate natural laws might just be responding to forces we don't understand yet." He pointed to his fields. "I plant crops that other farmers say won't grow in this soil. They say I'm working against nature, that I should plant what everyone plants. But I've learned that this soil has properties they don't understand. That what looks like wrong farming is actually right farming for these specific conditions." Fumiko thought about this. She had explained the river's apparent backwards flow, but Gonji was suggesting something deeper. That the river taught people to question their assumptions about what's natural, what's possible, what's right. The river looked wrong, but was responding perfectly to actual conditions. Both the optical conditions that made flow appear backwards, and the geological conditions that briefly pushed water uphill. "You're saying the river teaches us to look deeper before judging?" Fumiko asked. "More than that," Gonji replied. "It teaches us that backwards and forwards depend on what forces you're aware of. To someone who only knows gravity, water flowing uphill is impossible, wrong, against nature. But to someone who understands underground pressure, water flowing uphill is perfectly natural, a correct response to present forces." He gestured to the river. "How many things in life look wrong because we're only seeing some of the forces involved? How many people are judged for going against the flow when they're actually responding to forces others can't see?" Over the following months, Fumiko expanded her study. She began collecting stories of things that appeared to violate natural expectations, but actually didn't. They just responded to forces that weren't immediately obvious. A tree growing bent at a strange angle because of prevailing winds that had since died down. A flower blooming in winter because of an underground hot spring. A bird flying inland before storms because it sensed pressure changes humans couldn't detect. Each example taught the same lesson. What appears wrong might be responding perfectly to reality, while what appears right might be ignorant of important forces. A young mother came to Fumiko with a problem. My son won't follow the path I've set for him. He's going backwards from where he should go, against everything natural and right. How do I make him flow the right direction? Tell me about your son, Fumiko said. The mother described a boy who refused to take over the family business, who wanted instead to become a traveling musician. It's backwards, she insisted. Children should continue family work. That's the natural flow. He's going against nature. Or he's responding to forces you're not seeing, Fumiko suggested gently. Is he talented musically? Very, but that's not the point. Talent doesn't change duty. Doesn't it? Fumiko asked. The river appears to flow backwards because of forces beneath the surface. Perhaps your son is flowing in a direction that looks backwards to you, but is actually responding to forces inside him, talents, passions, purposes that you can't see or don't value. Just because his flow doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean it's wrong. She told the mother about the river, about how it appeared to defy nature, but actually followed it perfectly when all forces were considered. Your son might be like that river. What looks like backwards rebellion might be forward movement towards something he's meant to do. The question isn't whether he's flowing the way you expected, but whether he's flowing true to himself. This conversation troubled the mother, but she began to observe her son differently. She noticed how music seemed to flow from him naturally, how he came alive when playing, how his path, though different from hers, had its own rightness to it. Eventually, though it was difficult, she accepted that his backwards path might be his right path. Word spread about Fumiko's teachings about the backwards river. People began using it as a way to reconsider their own judgments. When someone's path looked wrong, they would ask, "Am I seeing all the forces involved? Or am I judging based on incomplete understanding?" A magistrate applied this thinking to a legal case. A man had broken a law, but when the magistrate investigated deeper, he found forces that explained the law-breaking in a way that changed the judgment entirely. The man wasn't defying order. He was responding to a greater order that the law itself hadn't anticipated. A teacher applied it to a student who learned differently from others. Instead of judging the student as backwards or wrong, the teacher looked for the forces, the different cognitive patterns, the unique intelligences that made the student's apparently backwards approach actually forward for him. Years later, Fumiko's study of the backwards river had become famous beyond the valley. She was invited to give lectures, to advise rulers, to teach scholars. But she always returned to the river itself, watching its apparently impossible flow, using it to remind herself that understanding requires humility, that what appears wrong might be right in ways she hasn't yet grasped. A visiting philosopher asked her, "But aren't some things actually wrong? Doesn't your river teaching lead to excusing everything, to saying nothing is really backwards because we just don't understand the forces?" "No," Fumiko replied carefully. "Some things are genuinely wrong. They're responding to destructive forces like cruelty or ignorance or selfishness. The river teaches discernment, not relativism. It teaches us to look for forces we might not see before judging, but after looking, we still make judgments. The difference is, our judgments are informed by deeper understanding rather than surface appearance." She pointed to the river. This river looks backwards, but isn't. But if a farmer tried to make his irrigation flow uphill without underground spring pressure, that would be genuinely backwards, genuinely wrong. The teaching isn't that everything is right. The teaching is that apparent wrongness requires investigation before judgment. Some backwards flows are responding to forces we need to understand. Others are just backwards. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider things in your life that appear backwards or wrong. Your own path that doesn't match expectations. Other people's choices that confuse you. Circumstances that seem to violate how things should be. Before judging these as wrong, ask, what forces might I not be seeing? What underground pressures might be pushing flow in directions that look impossible, but are actually perfectly natural? The backwards river teaches humility in judgment, curiosity before conclusion, openness to forces you don't yet understand. Not everything that looks wrong is right, but some things that look wrong are responding to reality more accurately than things that look right. The only way to know is to look deeper, to consider forces beyond the obvious, to remain humble about the limits of your understanding. Rest now in acceptance of apparent backwards flows in yourself and others. Let the river run its course, responding to all the forces acting on it, both visible and hidden. Trust that what looks impossible might be possible, that what seems backwards might be forward, that nature is wiser than our quick judgments about what's natural. The river knows where it's going, even when it appears to go the wrong way. There was a painter named Hero who specialized in landscapes, particularly sunsets. He would travel to scenic locations, set up his easel, and capture the magnificent colors of the evening sky. His paintings were admired and purchased by wealthy collectors throughout the region, but Hero harbored a secret anxiety. He worried that beauty only existed when someone was there to witness it. If a sunset occurred and no one saw it, was it still beautiful? If a mountain stood in perfect light, but no human eye appreciated it, did that beauty mean anything? This philosophical worry grew into an obsession. Hero began to feel that his purpose as an artist was essential, that without him and others like him to witness and record beauty, that beauty was somehow wasted, meaningless, lost. He expressed this concern to a Zen monk named Daigu, who lived near one of Hero's favorite painting locations. If I didn't come here to paint these sunsets, they would just happen and disappear with no one to appreciate them. Doesn't that seem like a waste? Daigu looked at Hero with gentle amusement. Let me ask you something. Before humans existed, before there were any conscious beings to witness them, did sunsets occur? Yes, I suppose so. And were they beautiful? How could they be beautiful if there was no one to see them? Ah, Daigu said. So you believe beauty is created by the observer rather than existing in the observed? This question troubled Hero. He had always thought beauty was a quality inherent in things, but maybe he was wrong. Maybe beauty was just a human interpretation, a meaning we project onto neutral phenomena. Daigu continued, Tonight, stay at my temple. In the morning before dawn, I'll show you something. That night, Hero could barely sleep, wondering what the monk would show him. Before sunrise, Daigu woke him and led him to a secluded valley far from any human habitation. We're going to leave now, Daigu said, and we're not going to look back. This evening, the sunset will occur here, with no human to witness it. According to your theory, that sunset will not be beautiful because there's no one to appreciate it. But how will we know? Hiro asked. Exactly, Daigu smiled. How will we know? And does not knowing change anything about what actually happens? They left the valley and returned to the temple. All day, Hiro thought about the sunset occurring in that empty valley. The sky is going through its evening transformation with no human eye to see it. Colors blooming and fading with no one to call them beautiful. That evening, sitting with Daigu as the sun set over the temple, Hiro said, "Right now, in that valley, the sunset is happening. And it's the same sky, the same light, the same colors as here. The only difference is, we're not there to see it." "And?" Daigu prompted. "And I realize my presence doesn't create the beauty. It just allows me to participate in it. The sunset doesn't need me to witness it to be what it is. My witnessing is a gift I receive, not a gift I give to the sunset." Daigu nodded. "The mountains were beautiful before humans arrived and will be beautiful after humans are gone. The sunset performs its daily miracle whether anyone watches or not. Beauty is not dependent on observers. It exists. Our observation of it is our privilege, not our creation or our responsibility." This understanding transformed Hiro's relationship with his art. He had been painting with a sense of urgent mission, as if he needed to capture and preserve beauty before it was lost to obscurity. Now, he painted with gratitude, recognizing that he was participating in beauty, not rescuing it. His paintings changed. They became less about controlling and capturing, and more about celebrating and sharing. Critics said his later work had a quality of joy that his earlier, technically superior work had lacked. One student asked Hiro, "If beauty exists without observers, why paint at all? Why bother witnessing it?" "Because witnessing is a joy," Hiro replied, "not a duty. I don't paint because the sunset needs me. I paint because I need the sunset. Being present to beauty enriches me. Sharing that experience with others through my paintings is a gift I offer. But the beauty itself doesn't depend on my offering. It simply is." He told the student about the sunset in the empty valley. Somewhere right now, a magnificent sunset is occurring that no human will ever see. No photograph will capture it. No painting will record it. It will happen and end and be gone forever from human knowledge. And that's perfect. That sunset doesn't exist for us. It exists because the earth turns and light bends, and atmosphere scatters color. We're fortunate when we get to witness it, but our witnessing isn't required. This lesson extended beyond sunsets to everything in Hiro's life. He realized he'd been placing himself at the center of existence, as if things needed him to matter. But actually, everything had its own existence, its own worth, independent of his awareness or appreciation. The tree in his garden was a tree whether he noticed it or not. The bird singing in the morning was completing its nature whether he heard it or not. The stars were shining whether he looked up at them or not. His presence as an observer was optional, not essential. Everything existed quite fully without him. "This could feel depressing," he told Daigu later. "Realizing that I'm not essential, that everything would continue without me." "Or it could feel liberating," Daigu replied. You don't have to carry the burden of making things matter. They already matter. Your role is simply to participate, to witness, to celebrate when you're fortunate enough to be present. This is a much lighter burden than thinking you must observe everything to validate its existence. Years later, when Hero was old and knew he was dying, a young painter came to him, worried. "When I die, who will paint these mountains? Who will witness these sunsets? Will all this beauty be wasted?" Hero smiled, remembering his own younger anxieties. "The beauty will be what it has always been, complete and independent of observers. Other people will witness it. And even if no people witnessed it, it would still be itself, still be beautiful in its own right. You're not the author of beauty. You're just a fortunate participant in it. Paint while you can, witness what you're able to, and rest easy knowing that beauty doesn't depend on you to exist." Tonight, as you rest, you might find relief in this teaching. The world doesn't need you to be constantly observing, appreciating, and validating it for it to have worth. Your life has value. Your presence matters, but not because everything depends on you. Rather, because you get to participate in existence, to witness beauty, to experience being alive. This moment, right now, is happening whether you're paying attention or not. The universe is unfolding whether you're conscious of it or not. You can rest completely, releasing all concern that you need to be witnessing and validating and appreciating every moment. Some moments will happen without you. Some beauty will bloom and fade unseen. And that's perfect. That's how it should be. Rest in the understanding that you're not the center of existence, but a participant in it, a grateful guest, not a required audience. Let the world exist without your constant attention. Let beauty be beautiful, whether you're watching or not. This is freedom. This is peace. This is the deep rest of knowing you can stop, can close your eyes, can let go completely, and everything will continue being exactly what it is. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. In a monastery famous for its scholarly debates and philosophical discussions, there arrived a new student named May, who puzzled everyone by her silence. While other students constantly asked questions, challenged teachings, and engaged in elaborate discussions about Buddhist philosophy, May simply listened, nodded, and returned to her meditation. The other students found this frustrating. They were proud of their intellectual engagement, their ability to analyze complex concepts, and their sophisticated questions. May's silence seemed like a criticism of their approach, or worse, like she wasn't intelligent enough to participate. One day, after a particularly intense discussion about the nature of emptiness, a senior student named Takeo approached May. "You never ask questions," he said. "Don't you have doubts? Don't you want to understand these teachings more deeply?" May looked at him with clear, calm eyes. "I understand enough to practice," she said simply. "But there's so much complexity, so many layers of meaning. How can you not have questions?" "I have one question," May replied. "Am I suffering less? If my practice reduces suffering, then I'm understanding. If not, then no amount of questions and answers will help." Takeo was taken aback. He realized that despite all his questions and discussions, despite his vast accumulation of knowledge about Buddhist philosophy, he was just as anxious, just as unsettled as when he had arrived at the monastery. He knew more, certainly, but he suffered no less. The monastery's abbot, Master Gensho, had been observing Mei quietly. Unlike the other students who sought her out for teaching constantly, Mei seemed to learn by watching, by practicing, by experiencing directly, rather than by asking for explanations. One afternoon, Master Gensho was working in the garden when Mei came to help him. They worked together in silence for an hour, pulling weeds, tending plants. Finally, Gensho spoke. "You don't ask questions like the others. Why?" Mei continued her work for a moment before responding. "When I'm thirsty, I drink water. I don't ask about the chemistry of H2O or debate the philosophical implications of thirst. The direct experience of drinking satisfies thirst in a way that talking about water never could." She pulled another weed carefully, examining its roots before setting it aside. The other students have many questions about enlightenment, about emptiness, about the nature of mind. But they could discuss these things forever and never experience what the words point toward. I'd rather practice one moment with full attention than discuss 1,000 concepts about practice. Gensho smiled. "You understand something they haven't yet learned. The teachings are like a finger pointing at the moon. Most people study the finger endlessly, analyzing it, asking questions about it, debating its exact position. But you're looking where the finger points." Mei nodded. "I watch you," she said simply. "The way you move through the garden with full attention. The way you respond to people with presence rather than scripted wisdom. The way you sit in meditation without strain or performance. These teach me more than any discussion could." "What have you learned by watching?" Gensho asked. "That peace doesn't come from understanding everything intellectually. It comes from being fully present to what is. That wisdom isn't accumulated knowledge but direct seeing. That the questions that seem so important eventually dissolve when you stop feeding them with attention and instead simply practice." She paused in her work, looking at the master directly. "The other students ask you hundreds of questions. I have only one. Am I doing the practice correctly? And your answer is in how you nod or don't nod when you see me sitting. That's all I need." Over the following years, something interesting happened. The students who had asked the most questions, who had engaged in the most elaborate discussions, often left the monastery still searching, still unsatisfied, still believing that the answer was in some concept they hadn't yet grasped. But Mei stayed, and her practice deepened. She didn't become a great scholar or a famous teacher, but people noticed a quality in her presence, a settledness that comes from direct understanding rather than intellectual knowledge. When Master Gensho became too old to teach, he surprised everyone by naming Mei as his successor. The scholarly students were bewildered. She had never demonstrated vast knowledge or sophisticated understanding. She had barely spoken in all her years at the monastery. At the ceremony, one bold student asked, "Master Mei, you never asked questions like we did. You never engaged in the discussions and debates that we thought were so important. Why should you lead us?" Mei looked at the gathered students with gentle eyes. "You learned about Buddhism," she said quietly. "I learned Buddhism. There's a difference." She picked up a cup of water. "If you're thirsty, and someone describes water to you in elaborate detail, explains its molecular structure, debates its philosophical significance, are you satisfied, or do you need to drink? She drank from the cup, then set it down. For years you've been studying descriptions of water while remaining thirsty. I just drank. Not because I'm smarter or better, but because I stopped believing that understanding the description was the same as tasting the reality. She looked around at them all. You can stay here and continue to ask questions if you wish. Questions are not wrong. Discussion is not wrong. But eventually, you might notice that the mind that asks endless questions is avoiding the practice that would make the questions unnecessary. Eventually, you might discover that some things can only be understood by direct experience, not by intellectual analysis. One student asked, "But how do we know if we're practicing correctly if we don't ask questions?" "Practice and watch what happens," May replied. "Are you kinder? Are you more patient? Are you suffering less? Is there more peace in your heart? These are not things you know by asking questions. These are things you know by looking honestly at your own experience." She stood to leave, then paused. "I'll tell you one more thing I learned by not asking questions. When your mind is quiet, when it's not constantly generating inquiries and debates and analysis, you can hear something deeper. You can hear the teaching that's always present, that doesn't need words, that comes from direct contact with reality itself. That's the teaching I chose to listen to." Tonight, as you rest, you might notice your own questioning mind. How many questions are running through your thoughts? Questions about tomorrow, about your life, about whether you're doing things right, about what it all means. What would happen if you let those questions rest for these hours of sleep? What if, instead of asking and analyzing and trying to figure everything out, you experience this moment directly? You don't need to understand everything to rest. You don't need to have all the answers to be at peace right now. Sometimes the wisest response to life's complexity is not another question, but a quiet presence. Not more analysis, but more direct experiencing. Not more words, but more silence in which to hear what words can never say. Let your questions burn themselves out tonight. Let your seeking mind rest. And in that rest, you might discover what May discovered. That direct experience often teaches what endless inquiry never can. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.